Some questions have no answers. They hang in the air for years, decades, even centuries. We know someone was killed. We know someone vanished. But we don't know who did it or why. There are over 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States alone since the 1960s. That number grows by about 6,000 every year. These are not just statistics. They are stories without an ending. They are ghosts in our history. Who are these people? What happened in their final moments? And why has justice remained so silent for so long? These cold cases are more than just puzzles. They are a reminder that sometimes the truth stays buried. Number 20. Who left the boy in the box? In February 1957, a college student was in a wooded area in Philadelphia. He was checking his muskrat traps. He saw a rabbit run into some bushes. When he followed, he found something else. A large cardboard box. Inside was the body of a small boy. He was naked and wrapped in a plaid blanket. The student was afraid. He didn't report it. A few days later, another man driving by saw the box. He stopped, he saw the boy and called the police. This was the start of a mystery that has haunted Philadelphia for over 60 years. The boy was estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old. He was malnourished. His body showed signs of severe abuse. He had multiple bruises and scars. His hair had been recently and crudely cut. Strands of his own hair were still on his body. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. Someone had hit him repeatedly. The police launched a massive investigation. They printed 400,000 flyers with the boy's picture. They put him in every gas bill in the city. The photo was on posters in every police station. Detectives went door to door. They checked orphanages and foster homes. No one came forward. No one seemed to be missing a child. It was as if the boy never existed. The box he was found in was from a J.C. Penney store. It had originally held a baby bassinet. Police tracked the sale of that specific model. They found 12 were sold in the area. They managed to track down 11 of the buyers. The 12th was never found. The blanket he was wrapped in was also common. It provided no real clues. Over the years, many theories emerged. One came from a woman who claimed her abusive mother bought the boy. She said her mother killed him in a fit of rage and forced her to help dispose of the body. Police found her story credible, but couldn't find enough evidence to prove it. Another theory pointed to a nearby foster home. A medical examiner, Remington Bristow, pursued this lead for years. He believed the boy belonged to the stepdaughter of the man who ran the home. But again, nothing could be proven. In 2019, investigators exhumed the boy's body to get a better DNA sample. They used modern genetic genealogy. This is the same technique used to catch the Golden State Killer. In late 2022, they finally announced a breakthrough. They had identified the boy. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was born in January 1953. With his name, they also identified his parents. The case is now an active homicide investigation again, but the discovery of his name just created more questions. His parents are long dead. He had living half-siblings who had no idea he ever existed. He was never reported missing. Why was a little boy's existence kept a secret? Who abused him so badly that they ended his life? And why did not a single person in his family or neighborhood ever speak up about a missing child? Number 19, what happened to the Sodder children? Christmas Eve, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family was celebrating. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children. Their oldest son was away in the army. The other 9 were home. That night, a fire broke out in the family home. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children escaped. But 5 of their children were trapped upstairs: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. They were aged 5 to 14. George tried to save them. He ran to get his ladder, but it was missing from its usual spot. He tried to start his trucks to pull up to the window, but neither would start. The phone line was dead. The fire department was slow to arrive. By morning, the house was a pile of ashes. The 5 children were gone. The official conclusion was that the children died in the fire. Their bodies were believed to have been cremated in the intense blaze. But George and Jenny Sodder never believed it. And Jenny, who had worked in a crematorium, knew it took a very hot fire over a long period to completely destroy human bones. Their house burned down in about 45 minutes. They began to notice strange things. Before the fire, a man had tried to sell them insurance and became angry when George refused. He warned that their house would go up in smoke and their children would be destroyed. Another man had been seen watching the younger children as they walked home from school. On the night of the fire, the phone rang around midnight. Jenny answered. It was a woman she didn't know asking for someone Jenny didn't know. Jenny heard laughter in the background. She hung up and noticed the lights were still on, which was unusual. She went back to sleep. A short time later, she woke up to the smell of smoke. The Sodders hired a private investigator. He discovered the insurance salesman who threatened them was on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. He also heard a strange confession. A bus driver told people he had seen the Sodder children peering out of a car window while the fire was still burning. A woman at a hotel between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she saw the children the morning after the fire. They were with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction. She said they checked out early the next morning. Years later, in 1967, Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked in Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back was a cryptic note. It read, Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. E little boys, A90132 or 35. The Sodders were convinced it was their son Louis, all grown up. They hired another private investigator to look into it, but he took their money and disappeared. George and Jenny Sodder never gave up hope. They put up a large billboard on Route 16 with the pictures of their 5 missing children. They offered a reward. George died in 1969. Jenny wore black for the rest of her life until she died in 1989. The billboard stayed up until shortly after her death. The surviving Sodder children continued the search. The official story is that the children perished, but the family believed they were kidnapped. Perhaps it was related to George Sodder's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government in his native Italy. The family suspected the local mafia was involved. Were the children's bodies really consumed by the fire, leaving no trace behind? Was the fire a deliberate act of arson to cover up a kidnapping? And who was the young man in the photograph sent to Jenny Sodder 2 decades later? Number 18. Why did a whole colony vanish? In 1587, a group of about 115 English settlers landed on Roanoke Island. It's off the coast of what is now North Carolina. This was England's second attempt to colonize the New World. The governor of the new colony was John White. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl shortly after they arrived. The baby's name was Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the Americas. But the colony was struggling. Supplies were low. Relations with the local Native American tribes were tense. And John White decided he had to go back to England to get more food and tools. He left his daughter, his granddaughter, and the rest of the colonists behind. He expected to be back in a few months, but his return was delayed. England was at war with Spain. The Spanish Armada was a major threat. Queen Elizabeth I ordered every available ship to be used for the war effort. White couldn't get a ship back to Roanoke for 3 years. When he finally returned in August 1590, on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, he found the settlement completely empty. The houses had been dismantled, the boats were gone. There was no sign of a struggle. No bones, no bodies. The only clue was a word carved into a wooden post. The word was Croatoan. Another carving, CRO, was found on a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, now called Hatteras Island. It was also the name of a friendly Native American tribe that lived there. White had told the colonists that if they had to move, they should carve their destination into a tree. He also told them to carve a Maltese cross if they were in danger. There was no cross. White wanted to sail to Croatoan Island to search for them, but a massive storm was approaching. His ship's anchor cable broke. The crew refused to go on. They forced him to return to England. John White never saw his family again. He died a few years later, never knowing what happened to the lost colony. For centuries, people have tried to solve the mystery. The leading theory is that the colonists assimilated with the local tribes. Perhaps they moved to Croatoan Island as planned. John Lawson, an English explorer, wrote in 1709 that he met some Hatteras Indians who claimed their ancestors were white people. They had gray eyes, which was uncommon among Native Americans. Recent archaeological work has added some weight to this theory. Archaeologists have found English pottery mixed with native pottery at sites on Hatteras Island and further inland. This suggests some of the colonists may have split into smaller groups and integrated with different tribes. Other theories are more dramatic. One is that the Spanish, who had a settlement in Florida, found the English colony and wiped it out. But there is no archaeological evidence of a battle. Another theory is that the colonists tried to sail back to England on their own and were lost at sea. Or perhaps they were killed by a more hostile tribe, like the Powhatan. Captain John Smith, leader of the Jamestown colony founded in 1607, heard a story from Chief Powhatan. The chief claimed he had attacked and killed a group of white settlers who had been living with another, but the story was vague and could not be confirmed. Did the colonists simply pack up and move, blending into the local population until their English identity was lost? Were they killed by disease, famine, or a hostile force? And what did the single word Croatoan truly mean? Is it a destination, a warning, or something else entirely? Number 17, who murdered the man who knew too much? Danny Casolaro was a freelance journalist. In the early 1990s, he was working on a story he called The Octopus. He believed he had uncovered a vast conspiracy. It connected many of the biggest political scandals of the 1980s. The Iran-Contra affair, the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International (BCCI), and a case involving a software company called Inslaw. Inslaw had developed a powerful case management software called Promise. The U.S. Department of Justice bought it, but then refused to pay the full amount. Inslaw sued and won, but the Justice Department kept appealing. Inslaw's founder, William Hamilton, claimed the government stole the software. He said they modified it with a backdoor to spy on other countries' intelligence agencies they sold it to. Casolaro believed the software theft was the key. He thought a shadowy group of men, many with ties to intelligence agencies, were at the center of it all. This octopus was involved in everything from arms, dealing to money laundering, to political assassinations. He was getting close to something big. He told his friends and family he was meeting a key source. This source was going to give him the final proof he needed to blow the story wide open. On August 10, 1991, Casolaro was found dead in a hotel room in Martinsburg, West Virginia. He was in the bathtub. His wrists were slashed multiple times, 10 to 12 cuts in total. The police ruled it a suicide. His family did not believe it. Casolaro was famously squeamish about blood. He had told his brother just days before his death, "If anything happens to me, don't believe it's an accident." He had been receiving threatening phone calls. He told people he was being followed. The scene in the hotel room was also strange. His briefcase, full of his notes and research, was missing. Nothing else in the room was touched. The hotel maid found a single piece of paper with a cryptic message left for her. When she returned later, it was gone. The medical examiner who initially ruled it a suicide later expressed doubts. He said the deep cuts on Casolaro's wrists were unusual for a suicide. Also, the presence of alcohol and a mild tranquilizer in his system wasn't enough to explain why he wouldn't have fought back against the pain. The Department of Justice investigated his death. They concluded it was a suicide. They said Casolaro was in debt and depressed about his investigation stalling, but many people found this unconvincing. Books like The Octopus by Ken Thomas and Jim Keith have kept the case alive. They argue that Casolaro was murdered because he got too close to the truth. His sources included high-level figures in the military and intelligence communities. One source was Michael Riconosciuto, a brilliant but unreliable tech expert with ties to the CIA. Riconosciuto claimed he was the one who modified the Promise software for the government. He was arrested on drug charges shortly before he was supposed to provide Casolaro with evidence. He claimed he was framed to shut him up. Was Danny Casolaro a brilliant investigative journalist on the brink of exposing a massive government conspiracy? Or was he a man who got lost in a world of spies and lies, ultimately taking his own life in despair? And if he was murdered, who was powerful enough to make it look like a suicide and walk away without a trace? Number 16, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most powerful men in America. As the president of the Teamsters Union, he controlled a massive and influential labor organization. But he also had deep ties to organized crime. The union's pension fund was essentially a bank for the mafia. They used it to finance casinos in Las Vegas and other illicit ventures. Hoffa's power made him a target for the federal government, particularly for Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. In 1967, Hoffa was sent to prison for jury tampering and fraud. In 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence. One of the conditions was that Hoffa could not participate in any union activities until 1980. Hoffa did not like that condition. He immediately began fighting to regain control of the Teamsters. This angered the mafia. They had found the new union leadership under Frank Fitzsimmons much easier to control. Hoffa was a problem they needed to solve. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was scheduled to have a meeting. It was at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit. He was supposed to meet with two men, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a powerful Detroit mobster, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a Teamsters official from New Jersey with mafia ties. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant. He waited. The other men never showed up. Around 2:30 p.m., Hoffa called his wife. He was angry. He said, "Where the hell's Giacalone?" That was the last time anyone ever heard from him. His car was found in the restaurant parking lot the next day. Jimmy Hoffa had vanished. The FBI launched a massive investigation. They knew it was a mob hit, but they couldn't prove it. The suspects all had alibis. Giacalone and Provenzano both denied ever having a meeting scheduled with Hoffa. The investigation has continued for decades. It has involved hundreds of agents, countless interviews, and numerous searches for Hoffa's body. Over the years, tips have led them to dig up a horse farm, a driveway, and the ground under a swimming pool. They have never found a thing. The most famous theory is that Hoffa was shot, his body put in a car, driven to a sanitation facility, and incinerated. Another popular story, which is largely considered a myth, is that he was buried in the concrete foundation of Giants Stadium in New Jersey. The key to the mystery likely lies with a few men who are now dead. One was Hoffa's close friend and foster son, Chucky O'Brien. Hoffa was last seen in a car that O'Brien had borrowed. A scent dog picked up Hoffa's smell in the car's trunk. O'Brien always denied any involvement. Another key figure was Frank, the Irishman Sheeran. He was a mob hitman and a friend of Hoffa. In his final years, he confessed to his biographer, Charles Brandt, that he was the one who killed Hoffa. His story is the basis for the book I Heard You Paint Houses, and the Martin Scorsese film The Irishman. Sheeran claimed he picked Hoffa up, drove him to a nearby house, and shot him twice in the back of the head. He said the body was then cremated, but the FBI found no blood evidence in the house Sheeran identified. Many investigators and journalists doubt his story. Where is Jimmy Hoffa's body? Was Frank Sheeran telling the truth, or was he a dying man trying to claim a piece of history? And will the full story of how the mafia disposed of one of America's most powerful labor leaders ever be known? Number 15. What does a ghost ship remember? In December 1872, a British ship called the Dei Gratia was sailing in the Atlantic Ocean. About 400 miles off the coast of the Azores, the crew spotted another ship. It was a brigantine named the Mary Celeste. It was drifting aimlessly. Its sails were up but torn. The crew of the Dei Gratia hailed the ship. No one answered. They watched it for 2 hours. It was moving erratically. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, knew the captain of the Mary Celeste, Benjamin Briggs. They were friends. Morehouse realized something was wrong. He sent a boarding party over to investigate. What they found was a ghost ship. The Mary Celeste was deserted. There was no one on board. Not Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, or the 7 crew members. The ship was in good condition. It was seaworthy. The cargo, 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, was mostly intact. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters. Valuables were untouched. There was a 6-month supply of food and water, but the ship's only lifeboat was missing. The ship's logbook was found. The last entry was on November 25th, 10 days earlier. It recorded the ship's position near the Azores. It mentioned no trouble. The mystery deepened at the salvage hearings in Gibraltar. The Attorney General in charge, Frederick Soley Flood, was convinced foul play was involved. He suspected the crew of the Dei Gratia had killed everyone on the Mary Celeste to claim the salvage money. But there was no evidence. He then suggested the crew of the Mary Celeste had murdered the Briggs family in a drunken rage and fled in the lifeboat. But the crew had a good reputation and the cargo denatured alcohol was undrinkable. Other theories emerged. A pirate attack, but nothing was stolen. A giant squid or sea monster. A waterspout, an explosion. Some of the alcohol barrels were empty, leading to a theory that vapor from the barrels exploded, blowing off a hatch. The crew, fearing a larger explosion, might have abandoned ship in the lifeboat, planning to return once it was safe. But a storm could have separated them from the ship, leaving them lost at sea. In 2002, a documentarian named Anne McGregor researched the case extensively. She proposed a plausible, non-supernatural explanation. The ship's chronometer was found to be faulty. The captain might have been much further west than he thought and out of sight of land when he expected to see it. The ship had also been recently refitted, and coal dust and debris from that work might have choked the pumps. Without working pumps, the captain would not know how much water was in the hold. He might have seen water on deck from rough seas, mistakenly believed the ship was sinking, and ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution. A single rope would have connected them to the Mary Celeste. If that rope snapped, they would have been adrift in the vast ocean. Why did 10 people abandon a perfectly good ship? Was it a calm, calculated decision based on a false alarm, or a panicked reaction to a sudden, terrifying event? And what was their fate after they lowered themselves into a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic? Number 14, who eyes the Isdal woman. On November 29th, 1970, a man and his 2 young daughters were hiking in a remote valley in Norway. The valley is known as Isdalen, or the Ice Valley. It has a dark history, with several hikers dying there in the past. As they hiked, one of the daughters smelled something strange. It was the smell of burning. They followed the scent and found the charred body of a woman. She was lying on her back between some rocks. The front of her body and her clothes were burned. She was surrounded by strange objects: a bottle of St. Halvard liqueur, 2 plastic water bottles, a plastic passport container, sleeping pills. But there was no campfire, and there was no identification. The police investigation turned up more mysteries. At the train station in the nearby city of Bergen, they found 2 suitcases. They were traced back to the dead woman. Inside, they found clothing, but all the labels had been carefully cut out. They found a wig, several pairs of non-prescription glasses, and a notepad with some coded entries. They also found 9 different passports, all fake, under different names. Police were able to trace her movements around Europe. She had stayed in multiple hotels in Norway and other countries. She used different names at each hotel: Fenella Lorch, Alexia Zarna Merches, Claudia Telt, Vera Jarrell. She spoke multiple languages, including German, French, Flemish, and English. She told hotel staff she was an antiques dealer. The coded notes in her notepad seemed to be a record of her travels. The autopsy revealed she had a high concentration of sleeping pills in her system. She also had carbon monoxide in her lungs, meaning she was alive when she was burned. There was a bruise on her neck, possibly from a blow. The official cause of death was ruled as a probable suicide by a combination of sleeping pills and burning. But many things didn't add up. Why go to such a remote, difficult-to-reach spot to die? Why burn yourself? And most importantly, why go to such extreme lengths to erase your identity? Cutting labels from clothes, using fake passports, speaking in code. This was not typical behavior for someone planning suicide. The case pointed towards espionage. This was the height of the Cold War. Norway was a strategic location, a NATO member bordering the Soviet Union. Was she a spy? Witnesses who saw her described her as elegant and well-dressed. A shoe salesman remembered her. He said she was with 2 men of Southern appearance. She seemed nervous. An artist made a composite sketch of her. It was published in newspapers worldwide. No one ever identified her. The police investigation was strangely closed after about a year. Many records from the case were classified. A fisherman reported seeing a woman matching her description in the company of 2 naval officers a few days before her death. He said she looked frightened. He reported this to the police, but they told him to forget about it. Was the Isdal woman a spy for an intelligence agency like the KGB or Mossad? Was she betrayed and eliminated by her own side, or killed by an enemy? Or was she involved in some other form of international crime? And why has her identity remained a complete secret for over 50 years? Number 13, who were the Hinterkaifeck murderers? Hinterkaifeck was a small, isolated farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. In 1922, it was home to the Gruber family. The family consisted of Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children, Casilia and Josef. They also had a maid, Maria Baumgartner. The family was not well liked in the nearby village. They were reclusive. There were dark rumors about an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. Little Joseph was rumored to be his son. In the days leading up to the murders, strange things happened at the farm. Andreas told neighbors he found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farmhouse, but none leading back. He heard footsteps in the attic, like a set of house keys went missing. A newspaper from Munich, which he had never seen before, appeared on the property. The previous maid had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, Someone killed the entire family. It was a brutal, vicious attack. The killer, or killers, used a pickaxe. They lured 4 of the family members, Andreas, his wife, his daughter Victoria, and young Casilia out to the barn, one by one, and smashed their skulls. Then they went into the house. They killed the 2-year-old Josef in his crib. They also killed the new maid, Maria, in her bed. It was her first day on the job. What's even stranger is that after the murders, the killer apparently stayed at the farm for several days. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney. The cattle had been fed. The dog was taken care of. Someone had eaten food in the kitchen. The bodies were not discovered for 4 days. The young Casilia had not been showing up for school. The family hadn't been to church. A search party went to the farm. They found the gruesome scene in the barn and the house. The police investigation was extensive. They interviewed over 100 suspects. But the small local police force was overwhelmed. They mishandled the crime scene. Friends and neighbors had walked all over it before the main investigators arrived from Munich. The heads of the victims were removed and sent to a clairvoyant for examination, a strange practice even for the time. The heads were later lost during World War II. Many theories have been proposed. One focused on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local man who is rumored to be the father of little Joseph. He had been in a relationship with Victoria. He acted strangely after the murders. He was one of the first to enter the barn and had disturbed the bodies. But he had an alibi. Another theory was that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who was supposedly killed in World War I, had actually survived. Perhaps he returned to find his wife had a child with another man and killed everyone in a jealous rage. But his fellow soldiers swore he had died in France. The police never found a motive. A robbery seems unlikely, as a large amount of money was found untouched in the house. This was a crime of rage, of personal vengeance. In 2007, students at a German police academy re-examined the cold case using modern investigative techniques. They concluded that they could not definitively solve the crime due to the lack of evidence and the time that had passed. However, they did identify a prime suspect. But out of respect for the suspect's living relatives, they have never publicly released the name. Who was the killer who lived with his victims' bodies for days? Was it a neighbor with a grudge, a jilted lover, or a stranger from the woods? And what was the secret that led to the slaughter of an entire family on their isolated farm? Number 12, who was the man on Somerton Beach? On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide, Australia. He was propped up against a seawall. He was dressed in a suit and tie. He looked like a businessman. There were no signs of violence. An unlit cigarette was resting on his collar. His pockets contained a few items, a train ticket, a bus ticket, a comb, and some chewing gum. But there was no wallet, no money, and no identification. The tags on his clothing had been removed. The autopsy found he was in peak physical condition. It also found congestion in his stomach and brain, suggesting he was poisoned. But toxicology tests found no trace of any known poison. The coroner concluded he had died from a poison that was either untraceable or so fast-acting that it left no evidence. The mystery deepened. Police found a small hidden pocket sewn into the man's trousers. Inside was a tiny, rolled-up piece of paper. On it were 2 words, printed in a distinctive font, Tamam Shud. Experts identified this as a Persian phrase, meaning it is ended or finished. It was torn from the final page of a book, a collection of poems called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Police put out a call to the public to find the book it came from. A man came forward. He said he found the book in the back seat of his unlocked car, which he had parked near Somerton Beach around the time the man was found. The book was missing its last page. The scrap of paper from the man's pocket was a perfect match. In the back of the book, police found faint pencil markings. There was a local phone number, and what appeared to be a coded message. The phone number belonged to a young nurse who lived near the beach. Her name was Jessica Jo Thompson. When police showed her a plaster cast of the dead man's face and chest, she reacted strangely. She seemed shocked and on the verge of fainting, but she denied knowing him. She also admitted that she had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it to a man named Alfred Boxall during World War II. Police thought they had their man, but they soon found Alfred Boxall alive and well with his copy of the Rubaiyat and the final page still intact. The coded message has never been deciphered. It has been examined by naval intelligence and expert cryptographers. It remains a jumble of letters. The case became a sensation, pointing towards Cold War espionage. Was the Somerton man a spy? Was he meeting a contact? Was he poisoned by an enemy agent? For decades, his identity was unknown. He was buried under a tombstone that read, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." In recent years, researchers like Professor Derek Abbott have used DNA to try and solve the mystery. In 2022, Abbott announced a major breakthrough. Using hairs found trapped in the plaster cast, he had used genetic genealogy to identify the man. He believes the Somerton man was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. Webb was born in 1905. He was married, but his wife had moved to Adelaide. He had a fascination with poetry. But identifying him only deepens the mystery. Why did Webb travel to Adelaide under a false name? Why did he have a nurse's phone number? And how did he die? Even if we know his name, do we know anything at all? Was Carl Webb a spy, a jilted lover, or something else entirely? What does the Unbreakable Code say? And was Jessica Thompson telling the truth when she said she didn't know the man on the beach? Number 11, who was Bella in the Wych Elm? In April 1943, 4 teenage boys were poaching in Hagley Wood in Worcestershire, England. They came across a large old wych elm tree. One of the boys, Bob Hart, climbed the tree to look for bird nests. As he looked down into the hollow trunk, he saw a human skull. It had some hair still attached and crooked teeth. The boys were scared. They made a pact to tell no one because they had been trespassing. But the youngest boy was too frightened. He told his parents, and they called the police. The police found an almost complete human skeleton inside the tree trunk. A pathologist, Professor James Webster, examined the remains. It was a woman, probably in her mid-30s. She had been dead for at least 18 months. This meant she was placed in the tree in late 1941. A piece of taffeta fabric was found in her mouth, suggesting she had been suffocated. Her hand was severed and buried nearby. Because the body was hidden in the tree, the murder might never have been discovered. It was a nearly perfect hiding place. But who was she? The police checked missing persons records across the country. They checked dental records. Nothing matched. The war was on and many people were displaced. It was hard to keep track of everyone. The case went cold. But then, a few months later, strange graffiti started to appear. On walls in the surrounding towns, written in chalk, were the words, "Who put Bella in the Wych Elm?" The name Bella had never been mentioned in the press. This suggested the graffiti writer had inside knowledge of the case. The messages continued to appear for years. They kept the mystery alive in the public imagination. Over the years, several theories emerged. One was that she was a victim of a witchcraft or black magic ritual. Hagley Wood had a long association with occult practices. Another theory came from an MI5 file declassified in the 1970s. It involved a Gestapo agent named Josef Jacobs. He was the last man executed in the Tower of London. He was captured after parachuting into England in 1941. He had a photograph of a woman with him. He said she was his lover, a German cabaret singer and actress named Clara Bauerloh. He claimed she was also a German spy. She was supposed to land in England after him, but she disappeared. Her last known performance was in 1941, the same year the woman in the tree was likely killed. The timing and the description fit. Was Bella actually Clara, a German spy killed by her own side or by British intelligence? Another compelling story came from a woman who contacted the police in 1953. She said her husband had confessed to the murder. He had been part of a German spy ring. He said they were meeting with a Dutch woman in the woods. She knew too much, so they killed her and put her in the tree. This story had details that seemed to fit, but there was no way to prove it. The skeleton itself has since been lost. It was in the possession of the University of Birmingham, but it vanished sometime in the 1970s. Without the remains, modern DNA testing is impossible. Who was this woman, given the name Bella by an anonymous graffiti artist? Was she a local woman killed in a domestic dispute, a spy murdered for what she knew, or the victim of a dark ritual in the woods? And who was the person who kept her memory alive with a haunting question scrawled on city walls? Number 10. Where is Judge Crater? On the evening of August 6, 1930, Joseph Force Crater was a happy man. He was a New York State Supreme Court justice. He was successful, well-connected, and on his way up. That night, he had dinner with a friend and a showgirl at a restaurant in Manhattan. After dinner, he told them he was going to a show. He hailed a taxi, waved goodbye, and disappeared forever. He was never seen or heard from again. The disappearance of Judge Crater became one of the biggest news stories of the decade. He was dubbed the missingest man in New York. The police launched a massive investigation. They dragged Rivers, they searched his apartment, they interviewed hundreds of people. What they found was a secret life. Judge Crater was not just a respectable judge. He had deep ties to Tammany Hall, the corrupt Democratic political machine that ran New York City. He was involved in shady financial dealings. He had a mistress. He had recently withdrawn large sums of money from his bank accounts. Just before he vanished, he spent hours in his office destroying documents. He also took several briefcases full of files home with him. Those files and the money were also missing. The theories were endless. Did he run away? Perhaps he took the money and started a new life with his mistress. This was a popular theory for a while, but Crater was a public figure. It would have been very difficult for him to remain hidden for long. Did he have amnesia? This was also considered, but seemed unlikely. The most plausible theory is that he was murdered. He knew too much about the corruption in Tammany Hall. An investigation into the selling of public offices was just beginning. Crater was a key player. He may have been about to be exposed, or he may have been planning to testify. Either way, he was a liability to some very powerful people. Killing him and making his body disappear would solve their problem. Over the years, many tips and confessions have surfaced. A mobster claimed Crater was killed and buried under the Coney Island boardwalk. A woman came forward in 2005 with a letter written by her deceased husband. The letter claimed that her husband and a few other men, including a police officer, had killed Crater and buried his body near a construction site. But none of these stories have ever been confirmed. Crater was not officially declared dead until 1939. His wife, Stella, found a hidden envelope in his drawer long after he disappeared. It contained checks and a note from the judge. The note hinted at some trouble, but gave no real clues. Stella always believed he was murdered. What was in the files that Judge Crater took from his office? Did he flee to escape a scandal, or was he silenced by the corrupt political machine he served? And where did the body of the missingest man in New York end up? Number 9. What happened on the Flannan Isles? The Flannan Isles are a small, remote group of islands off the western coast of Scotland. In December 1900, they were home to a newly built lighthouse and 3 lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. They were experienced men. Their job was to keep the light burning for passing ships. On December 15th, a steamer ship, the Arkstor, passed the islands. It noted that the lighthouse was not lit. This was unusual, but it was not reported until the ship docked a few days later. On December 26th, a relief vessel, the Hesperus, arrived at the islands to bring supplies and rotate the crew. The captain of the Hesperus, Jim Harvey, was immediately concerned. There was no flag flying from the flagpole. No one came down to the landing dock to greet them. He blew the ship's whistle and fired a flare. There was no response. A relief keeper, Joseph Moore, was sent ashore to investigate. What he found was unsettling. The gate to the compound was closed. The main door to the lighthouse was unlocked. Inside, everything was neat and tidy. The beds were unmade. The clock on the wall had stopped. A meal of salted mutton and potatoes was sitting uneaten on the kitchen table. One of the keeper's oilskin coats was still on its peg. This meant one of the men had gone outside into the stormy weather without his foul weather gear. The lamps were clean and refilled with oil, ready to be lit. But the 3 men were gone. A search of the island revealed more strange clues. On the western side of the island, there was evidence of a powerful storm. A supply crate had been smashed, iron railings were bent and twisted. A large block of stone weighing over a ton had been dislodged. The damage was at a height of over 100 feet above sea level. This suggested a massive rogue wave had hit the island. The official report, written by Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board, concluded that the men had been swept away by such a wave. He theorized that 2 of the men had gone out to secure the equipment during the storm. When they didn't return, the 3rd man, Donald MacArthur, went out to look for them, forgetting his coat in his haste. All 3 were then washed out to sea. This is the most logical explanation. But it doesn't explain everything. Why would all 3 experienced keepers go outside during a storm against regulations? The rules stated 1 man must always remain inside the lighthouse. Why was the uneaten meal on the table? The logbook entries also added to the mystery. Thomas Marshall had written of a terrible storm with high winds, the likes of which he had never seen. He wrote that James Ducat was very quiet and Donald MacArthur was crying. This was strange, as MacArthur was a tough, experienced seaman, not a man known to cry. The last entry, on December 15th, simply said, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." The handwriting and the tone seemed odd. Over the years, more fanciful theories have emerged. A ghost ship took the men away. They were abducted by aliens. They were eaten by a giant seabird. One story suggests one of the men went mad, killed the other two, and then threw himself into the sea. But there were no signs of a struggle. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers has become a modern myth, inspiring poems, songs, and even an opera. Were the three keepers simply victims of a freak wave, a tragic but natural accident? Or does the strange logbook entry point to something else, a psychological drama that played out in the isolation of the lighthouse, ending in a way we can only imagine? Number 8, who was D.B. Cooper? On November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man bought a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle. He used the name Dan Cooper. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a business suit with a black tie. He ordered a bourbon and soda. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant. She thought he was giving her his phone number and put it in her pocket. He leaned closer and said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The flight attendant went to the cockpit. The pilot contacted air traffic control. The airline agreed to the demands. The plane circled the Seattle-Tacoma airport for 2 hours while the FBI gathered the money and parachutes. The passengers were told there was a mechanical issue. They had no idea they were part of a hijacking. The plane landed. Cooper exchanged the 36 passengers for the ransom and the parachutes. He kept a few crew members on board. Then he gave his new instructions. The plane was to take off again and fly towards Mexico City. It had to fly at a low altitude, under 10,000 feet, and at a slow speed. Somewhere over the rugged, forested terrain of southwestern Washington, Cooper did something no one expected. He went to the rear of the plane, lowered the aft stairs, and jumped out into the cold, rainy night. He and the money disappeared into the wilderness. An enormous search began. The FBI and the military searched the likely drop zone for weeks. They found nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no money. The FBI investigation, codenamed Norjack, was one of the longest and most extensive in its history. They investigated over 800 suspects in the first 5 years. None of them could be definitively identified as Cooper. The case became a legend. D.B. Cooper, the name came from a minor police suspect who was quickly cleared, but the media latched onto it, became a folk hero to some. A guy who beat the system. In 1980, a small clue finally surfaced. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging a fire pit on the bank of the Columbia River. He found 3 bundles of rotting cash. It was part of Cooper's ransom money, identified by the serial numbers. The discovery was about 20 miles from the estimated drop zone. This led to more questions than answers. Did Cooper land in the river and drown? Did he bury the money and plan to come back for it later? The location of the money didn't quite fit with the flight path. Some experts believe the money was washed down the river from further upstream. Over the years, many men have been named as suspects. Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran who pulled off a similar hijacking a few months later, was a strong candidate. But he was later ruled out. Dwayne Weber, a World War II veteran, made a deathbed confession to his wife, saying, "I'm Dan Cooper." But DNA evidence didn't match. A recent investigation detailed in the documentary The Mystery of D.B. Cooper points to a man named Robert Rackstraw. He was a pilot and a veteran with a troubled past, but the FBI has never had enough evidence to charge him. In 2016, the FBI officially closed the active investigation. They said their resources could be better used on other cases. Did D.B. Cooper survive the jump? Did he land safely, hide his money, and disappear into a new life? Or did he die in the wilderness, his body and the rest of the money never to be found? And will we ever know the real name of the man who pulled off the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history? Number 7. What happened in Villisca? On the night of June 9th, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep. The next morning, it woke up to a nightmare. A neighbor noticed that the home of the Moore family was unusually quiet. The family, Josiah and Sarah Moore, and their 4 young children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, had been at a church event the night before. The neighbor, Ross Moore, no relation, knocked on the door. There was no answer. He got the spare key and went inside. In one of the bedrooms, he found two bodies in a blood-soaked bed. He ran out and called the town marshal. What the police found inside was a scene of unbelievable horror. All six members of the Moore family had been bludgeoned to death with an axe. Their skulls were crushed while they slept in their beds. There were also two more victims. Two young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were friends of the Moore children. They had stayed over that night. They were also murdered. 8 people, 6 of them children, were killed in their sleep. The killer had been methodical and brutal. After the murders, the killer covered all the mirrors and windows in the house with cloth. He took a 2-pound slab of bacon from the icebox and wrapped it in a towel. He left it on the floor of a downstairs room next to the axe he had used. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. The killer also seemed to have washed his hands in a basin in the kitchen. The investigation was a mess from the start. Hundreds of people from the town trampled through the crime scene before it was secured. Evidence was lost or contaminated. The police were overwhelmed. Several suspects were identified. One was Frank F. Jones, a powerful Iowa State senator and a business rival of Josiah Moore. Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving to start his own successful farm implement company. Jones was a powerful man who was not used to being crossed. It was rumored he hired a man named William Blackie Mansfield to commit the murders. Mansfield was a suspected serial killer, believed to be responsible for similar axe murders in other states. That he was in the area at the time, but he had an alibi. Another major suspect was Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling minister who had been at the church event with the Moores on the night of the murders. He left town on a train at 5 a.m. the next morning. He confessed to the murders years later, claiming God had told him to slay and slay utterly. But he later recanted his confession. He was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury. He was acquitted in the second. He was a strange man with a history of mental illness and sexual deviancy, but many believe he was not the killer. The slab of bacon and the covered mirrors led some to believe the killer was a transient, following a specific ritual. The crimes bore a striking resemblance to other unsolved axe murders that occurred along railroad lines in the Midwest around that time. This suggests the work of a serial killer riding the rails from town to town. The Villisca axe murders destroyed the town's sense of safety. Neighbors suspected neighbors. The community was torn apart. The house where the murders happened still stands. It is said to be one of the most haunted places in America. The crime remains officially unsolved. Who was the killer who walked into a family's home and slaughtered 8 people in their sleep? Was it a local man with a grudge, a mentally ill preacher, or a transient serial killer moving silently through the heartland? What was the meaning of the strange rituals left behind at the scene? Number 6. Who killed the Black Dahlia? Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had come to Hollywood with dreams of becoming a star, but she became famous for a different reason. On January 15th, 1947, a woman walking with her young daughter in a vacant lot in Los Angeles saw what she thought was a mannequin. It was Elizabeth Short's body. It was a gruesome and shocking sight. Her body had been cut in half at the waist. It was drained of blood and scrubbed clean. Her face had been mutilated. The corners of her mouth were cut up to her ears, creating a grotesque grin known as a Glasgow smile. She was posed almost like a piece of art. The press nicknamed her the Black Dahlia, a reference to a recent film noir, The Blue Dahlia, and her preference for black clothing. The murder of the Black Dahlia became one of the most sensational and publicized crimes in American history. The Los Angeles Police Department launched a massive investigation. They interviewed hundreds of people. They chased down thousands of leads. The public was obsessed with the case. The newspapers printed every lurid detail. Elizabeth Short's life was picked apart. She was portrayed as a troubled young woman who drifted through Hollywood, taking odd jobs and dating many men. This image was partly true, but it also obscured the real person. The investigation was plagued by false confessions. Over 50 people, mostly men, confessed to the murder. All of them were ruled out. The killer also seemed to be playing a game with the police and the press. About a week after the body was found, the editor of the Los Angeles Examiner received a package. Inside were Elizabeth Short's social security card, her birth certificate, photographs, and an address book. The items had been wiped clean with gasoline to remove fingerprints. The sender also included a note, made from cutout letters from magazines and newspapers. It said, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow. The killer sent a few more taunting, cut and paste letters. But then the communication stopped. The police had many suspects. One was a doctor named George Hodel. His own son, Steve Hodel, a retired lop-dad detective, became convinced his father was the killer. In his book, Black Dahlia Avenger, Steve Hodel lays out a compelling case. George Hodel was a brilliant surgeon who had the medical skills to perform the precise bisection of the body. He had a dark side with an interest in surrealist art and a history of sexual abuse. A police transcript from a bug placed in his home revealed him talking to himself saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." But the evidence was all circumstantial. No charges were ever brought. Other suspects included hotel owner Norman Chandler, mobster Bugsy Siegel, and even the actor and director Orson Welles. The list of potential killers was long, but the evidence was thin. The case files contained dozens of names. But the trail always went cold. The murder of Elizabeth Short has become a dark Hollywood legend, a symbol of the city's corrupt and dangerous side. It represents the ultimate cautionary tale of a young woman's dream turning into a nightmare, who had the surgical skill and the pure malice to commit such a horrific crime. Was it a spurned lover, a powerful Hollywood figure, or a sadistic doctor? And why has the Black Dahlia's killer remained a ghost in the City of Angels for so long? Number 5, what was the Zodiac speaking? In the late 1960s, a killer terrorized Northern California. He targeted young couples in remote, Lover's Lane type areas. He shot some of his victims, he stabbed others. He was brutal and seemingly random. He killed at least 5 people, though he claimed to have killed as many as 37. But what made this killer different was his need for attention. He gave himself a name. He called himself the Zodiac. The Zodiac killer began sending taunting letters to the San Francisco Bay Area newspapers. The letters were full of spelling errors and grammatical mistakes. They revealed details about the crimes that only the killer could know. He threatened more attacks if the newspapers didn't publish his letters on the front page. His most famous letters included ciphers, complex coded messages. He dared the police and the public to crack them. The first cipher, known as the 408 cipher, was solved within a week by a school teacher and his wife. It was a rambling message about how much the killer enjoyed killing people. It said he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. But his other ciphers were much more difficult. The 340 cipher remained unsolved for 51 years. It was finally cracked in 2020 by a team of amateur codebreakers. The message read, "In part, I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." The chilling use of paradise instead of paradise was typical of his strange writing style. There are still 2 short ciphers that remain unsolved. The killer also sent a piece of a victim's bloody shirt to prove he was who he said he was. He called into a TV talk show. He drew a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and signed his letters with it. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. The police investigation was massive. It spanned multiple jurisdictions. They had a description of the killer from 2 survivors. He was a heavy-set white man with glasses and crew-cut hair. They had a fingerprint. They had a partial palm print, but they could never match them to a suspect. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen. He was a former school teacher who had been fired for inappropriate conduct with students. He lived near one of the crime scenes. He wore a Zodiac brand watch. A friend told police that Allen had talked about killing people and writing coded letters. He owned the same type of gun used in one of the murders. He fit the physical description. The police searched his home. They interviewed him several times, but they could never find enough direct evidence to charge him. The fingerprint and palm print didn't match him. A DNA test on the saliva from one of the Zodiac's envelopes did not match Allen either. He died in 1992. The case has been kept alive by books like Robert Graysmith's Zodiac and the David Fincher film of the same name. As armchair detectives and professional investigators continue to pore over the letters and ciphers. In 2021, an independent group of investigators called the Casebreakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac killer as a man named Gary Francis Poste, who died in 2018. They cited new physical and forensic evidence, but law enforcement agencies have not confirmed their findings. The case officially remains open. Who was the man behind the hood and the strange symbol? Was it Arthur Lee Allen, Gary Poste, or someone else who was never even on the police radar? And what secrets do the final unsolved ciphers hold? Number 4, who was the Cleveland torso murderer? In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, was gripped by fear. A serial killer was stalking the city's poorest neighborhoods. The killer targeted transients and prostitutes, people living on the margins of society. The victims were often drifters, making them hard to identify. The killer's method was gruesome and consistent. He beheaded and dismembered his victims. He often castrated the male victims. The torsos were usually found first. The other body parts were sometimes found later, or not at all. The press called the killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run was a grim, impoverished area with shantytowns and a creek where many of the bodies were discovered. The official victim count is 12, 7 men and 5 women killed between 1935 and 1938. But some believe the killer may have been active for longer and in other cities. The dismemberments were clean and precise, suggesting the killer had a strong knowledge of human anatomy. He could have been a doctor, a surgeon, or a butcher. The investigation was led by, one of the most famous lawmen in American history, Eliot Ness. After his famous takedown of Al Capone in Chicago, Ness had become Cleveland's public safety director. He was determined to catch the killer. Ness and the Cleveland police were frustrated at every turn. The victims were hard to identify. There were no witnesses. The killer left no clues at the scenes. In a desperate move, Ness ordered the complete destruction of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns. He had the shacks burned to the ground, forcing the homeless population out of the area. His hope was to deprive the killer of his hunting ground and potential victims. The murders did stop in Cleveland after this, but the killer was never caught. The main suspect in the case was a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney. He was a doctor and a veteran of World War I who had worked as a field surgeon, giving him the necessary skills for dissection. He was an alcoholic who came from a prominent family. He was brought in for questioning by Ness himself. Sweeney failed 2 very early polygraph tests. Ness was convinced Sweeney was the killer. But Sweeney was the first cousin of one of Ness's political rivals, a congressman. Charging him would have created a political firestorm. Ness didn't have enough evidence for a conviction. After the interrogation, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a mental institution. He spent the rest of his life in veterans' hospitals. He would taunt Ness by sending him postcards from the hospital. Some believe the murder stopped because the main suspect was locked away. Another theory, proposed by author James Jessen Badal in his book In the Wake of the Butcher, is that there was no single killer. He suggests some of the murders may have been unrelated crimes lumped together by the press and police. The case remains one of the most notorious unsolved serial murder cases in U.S. history. The identity of the Mad Butcher, who terrorized the city and taunted its most famous lawman, is a secret that has been kept for nearly a century. Was Dr. Francis Sweeney the brilliant but disturbed surgeon behind the killings? Was Eliot Ness right, but powerless to act? Or was the killer someone else entirely, a ghost who vanished as quickly as he appeared? Number 3, who built the Gardner heist? In the early morning hours of March 18, 1990, the day after St. Patrick's Day, 2 men dressed as police officers walked up to the side entrance of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. They told the 2 young security guards on duty that they were responding to a disturbance call. The guards, against protocol, let them in. Once inside, the 2 fake cops revealed their true intentions. They were art thieves. They quickly overpowered the 2 guards, tied them up with duct tape, and left them in the museum's basement. For the next 81 minutes, the 2 thieves had the museum to themselves. But they were not typical art thieves. Their choices were strange. They ignored some of the most valuable pieces in the museum. Instead, they seemed to have a specific shopping list. They went to the Dutch room and cut 2 of the most valuable paintings in the world out of their frames: Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, his only known seascape, and Vermeer's The Concert, one of only about 34 known Vermeers in existence. They also took another Rembrandt, a flink, and a Chinese bronze beaker. They tried to take a Rembrandt self-portrait, but it was too big. They smashed a case to steal a Napoleonic eagle finial. Then they left. The total value of the stolen art is estimated to be over $500 million. It is the largest single property theft in history. The FBI investigation has been going on for over 30 years. It has led them deep into the world of the Boston mob. The prime suspects are connected to a local crime crew led by a mobster named Carmelo Merlino. The FBI believes the thieves were a low-level career criminal named George Reisfelder and a mob associate named Lenny DiMuzio. Both men are now dead. The mastermind, the FBI believes, was a made man in the Boston Mafia named Robert Bobby Garante. He died in 2004. In 2013, the FBI announced they were confident they knew who the thieves were. But they still don't know where the art is. The theory is that the art was stolen to be used as a bargaining chip, a get-out-of-jail-free card for a mobster facing a long prison sentence. It was passed from one mobster to another. The trail leads to a Connecticut mobster named Robert Bobby the Cook Gentile. The FBI searched his home multiple times. They found a handwritten list of the stolen artworks with their estimated black market prices. But Gentile, who died in 2021, always denied knowing where the art was. The museum is still offering a $10 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the art. The empty frames from which the masterpieces were cut still hang on the museum walls. They are a constant haunting reminder of the loss. Where are the 13 stolen artworks? Are they hidden in a vault, hanging on the wall of a private collector, or have they been destroyed? And will the greatest art mystery of our time ever be solved? Or will the frames at the Gardner Museum remain empty forever? Number 2. What happened to the princes in the tower? In 1483, England was in turmoil. King Edward IV died unexpectedly. His heir was his 12-year-old son, who was to become King Edward V. The young king and his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York, were placed under the protection of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm. He escorted the young king to London to prepare for his coronation. He housed the boy in the Tower of London, which was then a royal residence as well as a prison. He then brought the younger brother Richard to the Tower as well, supposedly to keep the young king company. But the coronation never happened. Richard of Gloucester made a shocking claim. He declared that his brother's marriage to the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was invalid. This meant that the two princes were illegitimate and had no claim to the throne. Parliament agreed. Richard of Gloucester was crowned King Richard III. The two young princes remained in the Tower of London. They were seen playing in the garden for a few weeks. Then, in the summer of 1483, they vanished. No one ever saw them again. What happened to them is one of the oldest and most enduring mysteries in English history. The prevailing theory, popularized by Tudor historians and William Shakespeare in his play Richard III, is that Richard III had his nephews murdered to secure his own claim to the throne. This theory is compelling. Richard had the motive and the opportunity. The boys were a threat to him as long as they were alive. The historian Thomas More, writing years later, claimed that Richard hired a man named Sir James Tyrrell to kill the boys. Tyrrell supposedly confessed to the crime years later, saying he had smothered the princes with their pillows and buried them at the foot of a staircase in the tower. In 1674, workmen doing renovations in the tower found a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 young children. They were believed to be the remains of the princes and were buried in Westminster Abbey. But not everyone is convinced of Richard's guilt. The Richard III Society argues that the case against him is based on Tudor propaganda. As the Tudors, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, had every reason to blacken his name to legitimize their own rule. They point to another suspect, Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. He also had a motive to kill the boys, as they had a stronger claim to the throne than he did. Another suspect is the Duke of Buckingham, a former ally of Richard III who later rebelled against him. Perhaps he killed the boys and tried to frame Richard for the crime. There is also a slim possibility that one or both of the boys survived. In the years after their disappearance, several young men came forward claiming to be one of the lost princes. The most famous was Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be the younger prince, Richard. He gained support in Europe, but was eventually captured by Henry VII and executed. In 2012, the skeleton of Richard III was famously discovered under a parking lot in Leicester. Modern science has been able to tell us a great deal about him, but it cannot answer the question of what he did to his nephews. The Church of England has so far refused requests to exhume the remains in Westminster Abbey for DNA testing to confirm if they are indeed the princes. Did Richard III order the murder of his own nephews, a crime that has made him one of history's greatest villains? Or is he the victim of a historical smear campaign, with the real killer being someone else entirely? And are the bones in Westminster Abbey truly the lost princes, or is the final chapter of their story still waiting to be discovered? Number 1. Who was Jack the Ripper? In the autumn of 1888, the Whitechapel district of London was a place of extreme poverty, crime, and despair. It was the perfect hunting ground for a new kind of monster, a killer who preyed on the most vulnerable women in the city prostitutes. He was not the first killer in London, but he was different. He was brutal, sadistic, and elusive. And he gave himself a name that would become a synonym for terror, Jack the Ripper. The canonical 5 victims attributed to the Ripper were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All were killed between August and November of 1888. The murders grew progressively more savage. The killer cut his victims' throats. Then he would mutilate their bodies, removing internal organs with a degree of skill that suggested he had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered in her own room. The scene was so horrific that even seasoned police officers were shocked. The murders created a media frenzy and widespread panic. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer. The investigation was one of the largest in London's history. They interviewed thousands of people. They followed hundreds of leads, but they were hampered by the lack of modern forensic techniques. There were no fingerprints, no DNA. The killer was a shadow who moved through the dark, foggy streets of Whitechapel, killed and vanished. He added to his own legend by sending letters to the police and the press. The most famous is the From Hell letter, which was sent with a small box containing half of a human kidney, believed to be from the victim Catherine Eddowes. The letter was signed, "Catch me when you can." Over the 130 years since the murders, the list of suspects has grown to over 100. They range from the plausible to the absurd. One of the main police suspects at the time was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who was found drowned in the Thames shortly after the last murder. His own family suspected he was the killer. Another strong suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He had a history of mental illness and a hatred of women. A senior police official wrote in his memoirs years later that he was convinced Kosminski was the Ripper. In 2014, an author claimed to have proven Kosminski's guilt using DNA evidence from a shawl supposedly found near one of the victims. But the scientific validity of this claim has been heavily disputed. Other suspects include Soren Klosowski, also known as George Chapman, a poisoner who was hanged for murdering 3 of his wives, and Walter Sickert, a famous artist who was fascinated by the murders and included them in his paintings. The crime writer Patricia Cornwell has spent millions of her own money trying to prove Sickert was the killer, but her theory is not widely accepted. The mystery of Jack the Ripper is not just about who he was, it's about how he was able to commit such terrible crimes and never be caught. He was a symbol of the dark underbelly of Victorian society. He exposed the deep social problems of the time. He remains the archetypal cold case, the ultimate faceless killer. Who was the man who walked the streets of Whitechapel holding a doctor's bag and a terrible secret? Was he a doctor, a butcher, an artist, or just a madman? And will the true identity of history's most notorious serial killer ever be anything more than a guess?